600 people once filled this village. 3 still do, 40 years after the ground itself became the enemy. The safety test that started all of it took less than a minute to spiral out of control. 50,000 people 2 kilometers away, packed light for a trip home that never came. 10 kilometers past that, an entire forest was declared unfixable and buried exactly where it stood, still too dangerous to walk through. This is the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the deadliest ring of forest in Europe that a handful of grandmothers simply refuse to leave. Stay for the reason the soil let anyone come back at all. It isn't the one the safety warnings ever mentioned. A well handle creaks. Chickens scatter across bare dirt. Somewhere behind a fence line gone soft with rust, a woman in rubber boots bends over a row of potatoes, the same row her mother planted 70 years before her. Nothing here looks wrong. That is the point. This is Ferris, one of a scattering of villages inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a 2,600 square kilometer ring of forest and farmland sealed off in the spring of 1986, when reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded and burned for 10 days, releasing more radioactive material than 400 Hiroshima bombs. 116,000 people were evacuated. They were told it would be for a few days. It has been 4 decades. Almost everyone left and never came back. A few hundred did the opposite. They are called samosely, self-settlers, mostly elderly, mostly women, mostly people who were born in these exact houses and intend to die in them. Officially, their presence is illegal. Practically, the authorities who once dragged them out by the arm now deliver their pensions by mail. The math of what they gave up is simple, and it is not measured in money. A village here that held 600 residents before the disaster now holds 3. Multiply that collapse across 160 villages, and the picture is not of a slow decline. It is of a civilization that ended in an afternoon and kept breathing in a handful of rooms. One frayed decision, made in the chaos of 1986, meant the difference between resettlement in a Kiev high-rise and 40 more years on native soil. They chose the soil. The village had already stood through a Stalinist famine engineered to starve millions, and through a Nazi occupation that emptied its churches. By the time an invisible cloud drifted over the rooftops, its oldest residents had already outlived worse enemies than one they couldn't see, smell, or touch. So when the soldiers came a second time, some of them didn't move. They just kept planting potatoes, the same rows, the same spacing, the same rhythm their hands had known since before the reactor even had a name most of them could pronounce correctly. The village sits inside a ring nobody drew for farmers. It was drawn for physicists. 30 kilometers out from the reactor, a checkpoint interrupts the road. Soldiers, a barrier arm, a stamp that decides who passes. Cross it without the right paperwork, and you are, on paper, a trespasser inside your own country. The zone runs on permission slips now, not property deeds, and the paperwork has outlasted 3 different national governments since 1986. For the samosely, that line was crossed the other direction, inward, on foot, at night, through gaps in fences meant to keep an entire species out. They weren't smuggling anything. They were smuggling themselves home, walking distances that would take a healthy adult the better part of a day, in shoes not built for it, because the alternative was a life in someone else's high-rise apartment. Officially, the government can still remove them. Every few years, someone in an office far from any checkpoint raises the possibility again, and every few years it quietly goes nowhere. Tolerance, here, is just enforcement that got tired. Where the checkpoint controls the border, the soil controls everything inside it. Cesium-137 doesn't announce itself. It has no smell, no color, no weight you can feel underfoot. It settled into these fields in 1986 as fallout, carried by wind patterns nobody could see, and it has stayed, migrating a few centimeters a year through topsoil that looks, to the naked eye, exactly like the topsoil 3 villages over that was never touched at all. A tablespoon of contaminated dirt here can carry more long-term radioactivity than a truckload from almost anywhere else in Europe. The garden outside the window produces beets, onions, and potatoes that look, taste, and often test close to normal, because contamination in soil is not evenly distributed contamination in food. Roots pull up what they pull up. Some plants resist cesium uptake almost entirely. Others concentrate it like a filter working in reverse. But some of what grows here is not fine. Nobody in the village owns a lab, and the nearest testing facility is a full day's round trip past the checkpoint. They eat anyway, because the alternative is not eating. Right now, that garden is producing beets and potatoes that mostly test close to normal. But mostly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And nobody in the house owns a lab that could tell them which plate is the exception. If it were your dinner table, would you trust the odds? Halfway around the exclusion zone, in villages with names most maps have stopped printing, the nearest hospital is not a short drive. It is not any drive at all, most days, because there is no ambulance stationed inside the zone, and outside vehicles are reluctant to cross a military checkpoint for a house call that might take hours to clear. A broken hip here is not an emergency in the way it would be anywhere else. It is a negotiation with distance, with weather, with whoever happens to own a working vehicle, and enough fuel to spare that week. No pharmacy, no clinic, no scheduled visit from a doctor who isn't also required to file paperwork about their own radiation exposure before entering and after leaving. The elderly residents who need daily medication ration it, stretch it thin across weeks it was never meant to cover, sometimes simply run out and wait for a delivery that may or may not come before the next one is due. No hospital, no pharmacy, just whatever the body can survive on its own, in a population whose average age has climbed into the late 70s. Yet the isolation that starves the village of doctors has fed something else entirely. Wolves, largely absent from these forests for a generation before the disaster, now move through the exclusion zone in numbers more than 7 times higher than in nearby nature reserves untouched by radiation. Wild boar root through abandoned orchards that used to be fenced and tended. Moose wander empty streets that once carried commuter traffic to a nuclear plant that employed thousands. For the last human residents, this isn't a nature documentary playing on a screen somewhere. It's a neighbor, and not always a polite one. Livestock has to be locked down every night without exception. Gardens get fenced against animals that no longer fear the smell of people, because for 40 years, mostly, there haven't been enough people left to be afraid of. The village got smaller, house by house, funeral by funeral. The forest didn't wait around to notice, and it didn't ask permission to move back in. But of everything working against the samosely, winter is the oldest enemy, and the one radiation never touched or made any worse. Snow closes the unpaved roads between villages for weeks at a time, sometimes longer, cutting off neighbors who might otherwise check on each other daily. Firewood has to be cut and stacked months in advance, because once the drifts set in, no delivery truck is coming, checkpoint clearance or no checkpoint clearance. Wells freeze at the pump. Power lines, strung decades ago for populations of hundreds that no longer exist, go down under the weight of ice and stay down for however long it takes a repair crew to justify the trip. An 80-year-old woman with a chest cough and 3 feet of snow between her and the nearest working phone line is not a metaphor built for a documentary. It happens most winters to someone in one village or another. And by the time anyone finds out, The outcome is usually already decided. The reactor gets the headlines, decade after decade. The cold does the actual, unglamorous killing, one bad January at a time. Here's what almost nobody explains about why some of this soil is survivable at all. The village garden holds on not despite its clay content, but because of it. A process called interlayer fixation means every clay particle actually locks cesium-137 into its crystal lattice, collapsing shut around the atom like a trapdoor. 19 years after the disaster, more than half of the zone's cesium was still sitting frozen in the top 4 inches of ground. It's the same principle now engineered into bentonite clay barriers sealing geological nuclear waste repositories worldwide. Which is why a garden in clay-heavy Parishiv stays plantable, while sandy floodplain soil 20 miles away keeps releasing cesium back into the food chain for decades longer. But knowledge like this only matters if the ground cooperates, and half a mile down the road, it doesn't. For one segment, put the danger down. Spring arrives here the way it always did, uninterrupted by evacuation orders. Storks return to nest on the same chimney stacks they've used for generations, indifferent to who does or doesn't live beneath them. Apple trees planted before the disaster still blossom in rows nobody replanted, because nobody needed to. They simply kept growing through decades when their owners weren't watching. Inside the house, the rhythm is almost unbearably ordinary. Bread rises. A kettle whistles on a wood stove. A cat naps in a patch of sun on a windowsill that has outlasted the government that built it. In the yard, chickens work a small circuit around the same 3 trees they've worked every morning for years. And somewhere down the lane, a rooster keeps time nobody asked it to keep. This is what 4 decades of stubbornness bought. Not safety, not comfort, but continuity. The right to wake up in the room you were born in, plant the same seeds your mother planted, and watch the same sunrise cross the same window frame it has crossed for 100 years. But continuity is not the same as permanence. Every spring, there are fewer windows with smoke rising from the chimney. But continuity had to be fought for, and one woman fought for it out loud, in front of witnesses. When soldiers came to drag Hanna Zavorotnya out of her village in the summer of 1986, she didn't argue about radiation levels or resettlement paperwork. She told them plainly, "Shoot us and dig the grave, otherwise we're staying." She had already survived a famine engineered by Stalin's government that killed millions across Ukraine, and a Nazi occupation after that. In the same house she was now refusing to abandon a 3rd time. An invisible enemy that took weeks or years to make you sick didn't frighten her the way a threat she could see coming would have. "Radiation doesn't scare me," she told a documentary crew decades later, peeling mushrooms outside the same door the soldiers once stood in. "Starvation does." She got to keep her house. She did not get to keep very many neighbors, and by the time the cameras found her, she was one of the last women left on her street, tending a garden that had slowly become the only occupied plot for half a mile in either direction. Elsewhere in the zone, an entire bureaucracy quietly agreed to pretend nothing unusual was happening. Eligible pensioners inside contaminated territory still receive a monthly government supplement on top of their regular pension, collected in person from administrative points outside the checkpoint, or delivered by a postal worker who drives a fixed route through villages the government still won't officially admit are inhabited. The same country that calls their residents illegal keeps a spreadsheet of their names, tracks their residency documentation, and mails them a check anyway, month after month, as if the address itself weren't the whole problem. It is bureaucracy on autopilot, a system built to serve people, still serving them, in a place that isn't supposed to have anyone left to serve. The postal workers' route hasn't been officially shortened in decades, even as the number of doors she stops at keeps shrinking, year over year, name by name, crossed off a list nobody has the authority to formally close. Nobody canceled the paperwork. Nobody canceled the people either. Their pantry runs on land, not on income, and the land keeps a ledger of its own that nobody in the house can read. Mushrooms and berries foraged from the surrounding forest are efficient bioaccumulators of cesium-137, absorbing it from soil at rates far higher than garden vegetables, meaning a plate of wild mushrooms can carry a radiation dose that a plate of homegrown potatoes from the same yard never would. Homemade moonshine, distilled from grain grown in the same fields, rounds out a diet built almost entirely from what the ground provides, tested or not, because a bottle of it is easier to produce than a bus ticket to somewhere the water is guaranteed clean. For families in Kyiv, any one of these ingredients would be a health scare on the evening news. Here, it's simply what's for dinner, prepared the same way it was prepared before anyone had heard the word cesium. Nobody's checking every plate. There's no one left whose job it is to check it for them, and no lab within reach that could do it quickly enough to matter before the meal goes cold. Meanwhile, a different kind of visitor treats their address like an attraction. Groups of thrill-seekers known locally as stalkers sneak past the same checkpoints the samosely once slipped through themselves, hunting for radiation spikes and abandoned buildings to photograph and post online. Licensed tours bring paying tourists through in buses on set schedules, cameras out, dosimeters clicking for effect at pre-approved stops. Some travelers pay real money, flights included, for a few curated hours inside a place these women have lived in, unpaid and unphotographed, for 40 straight years. Visitors treat the empty streets as a backdrop for a story about the past. The samosely treat them as a driveway they still have to shovel every winter. One group leaves at sundown, headed back to a hotel with hot water and a story to tell over dinner. The other never really left at all, and never gets asked for a photo on the way out. What plays as extraordinary on a screen is, to the person living it, simply Tuesday. Waking before dawn to milk a goat that grazed all week on grass nobody has tested this season. Walking 2 kilometers to check on a neighbor who didn't answer the phone, because there isn't reliable phone service to not answer in the first place. Boiling well water out of habit more than certainty about what's actually in it. None of it feels cinematic from the inside, the way it looks in footage shot by a visiting crew with better lighting than the kitchen has ever had. It feels like chores, because it is chores. The extraordinary, repeated daily for 4 decades without an audience, eventually just becomes a life like any other. And in 2022, even that fragile routine got interrupted by something that had nothing to do with reactors or radiation at all. Russian forces seized the Chernobyl site in the opening days of the full-scale invasion and held it for over a month, cutting supply routes into the zone and disrupting the already thin services reaching the samosely. Deliveries stopped without warning. Checkpoints changed hands more than once. An aging population that had spent decades measuring danger in becquerels suddenly had to measure it in troop movements they had no way of tracking from an unheated kitchen. The occupation itself ended in weeks, reversed by Ukrainian forces in early April. The residents it aged, isolated further, and in some cases outright endangered, did not get those weeks back, and no government supplement was ever issued to cover the fear of that particular march. 10 kilometers from the reactor, there is a forest that isn't green anymore. In 1986, the pine trees closest to the explosion absorbed a radiation dose so extreme they turned reddish-brown within days and died standing up. Soviet crews called it the Red Forest. They did not plant new trees to replace it. They bulldozed the dead ones into trenches and buried them where they fell, sealing roughly a square mile of radioactive timber under a few feet of dirt, and left. The forest that grew back on top is younger, thinner, and still standing on a floor no one has fully cleared. Air here can still register radiation readings, tens of times higher than background levels feet away. Some patches remain among the most contaminated ground on the planet, decades after the fire went out. Scientists who work in the red forest today do it in short shifts, with dosimeters clipped to their collars, and a hard limit on how long they're allowed to stay. Workers rotate through in hours. The samosely live a few kilometers from its edge in years. No fence marks exactly where safe ends and lethal begins. The border is invisible, and it moves as slowly as the wind lets it. One long-term study estimated a lifetime cancer risk elevated for every person who spent extended time within its boundary in the disaster's early years. A number that never applied evenly, that fell hardest on whoever happened to be standing closest when the wind changed direction. Nobody chose where they were standing. The wind decided that part. Children who played near its tree line in the spring of 1986, before anyone understood what had drifted over their rooftops, are grandparents now, if they lived long enough to become one. The forest doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain itself. It just keeps standing there, quietly more dangerous than almost anywhere else on Earth. 3 miles from a kitchen where someone is boiling potatoes for dinner. Air that thickens in the chest if you breathe it wrong. Ground that stays hot for a human lifetime, and then some. Trees that grew back taller than the ones they buried. It is still there. It is not going anywhere. The red forest didn't get this way by accident. It's the direct result of one specific night, one delayed test, and one decision that took less than 60 seconds to go wrong. That night is still coming, told in full, closer to the end of this video than you'd expect. It looks like an amusement park. It never actually was one. Pripyat's Ferris wheel was built for a May Day opening on May 1st, 1986. 5 days after the reactor exploded 4 kilometers away. The city was evacuated before a single ticket was sold, before a single gondola ever carried a paying rider around the loop it was engineered to make thousands of times a season. Its bumper cars, its carousel horses, its rows of yellow gondolas have sat exactly where the builders left them for 40 years. Rusting under a sky that never once saw them running with children in the seats, waiting for an opening day that simply never arrived and now never will. Photographs of it circulate online as shorthand for apocalypse, the single most recognizable image of the entire disaster. What they're actually showing is something stranger and less final. A grand opening that got interrupted mid-sentence and simply never resumed. 40 years and counting. It isn't a ruin of something that ended. It's a pause that outlived everyone who could unpause it, and everyone who was ever meant to ride it as a child has long since become someone's grandparent, if they became anything at all. The reactor's cooling pond looks, from the bank, like any quiet lake you'd find on a Sunday drive. It isn't. Catfish inside it have grown to sizes locals and visitors alike describe as arm length and larger, gliding beneath the surface in numbers that startle first-time visitors who lean over the railing expecting minnows and find something closer to a dog swimming past their reflection. The fish aren't radioactive mutants in the way pop culture likes to imagine. Most researchers attribute the size to decades without fishing pressure and an artificially warm pond stocked with more food than any fish here could finish, not fallout working some kind of transformation on their bodies. But nobody who watches one surface for a crust of bread thrown by a tourist quite manages to relax about it, no matter how many times the science gets explained. The explanation is boring. The reaction to it never is. 40 years after the evacuation, packs of stray dogs still move through Pripyat's courtyards and the empty streets between the apartment blocks. Descendants, most likely, of pets left tied up, or simply let loose by families, who were told they'd be back within days and packed accordingly. Aid workers now run seasonal vaccination and sterilization programs inside the zone just to manage a population that was never supposed to exist this long, feeding and treating animals whose great-great-grandparents were somebody's childhood pet. The dogs approach vehicles for food with a familiarity that has nothing to do with the empty apartment blocks looming around them, and everything to do with 40 generations of learning, passed down without a single word, that humans, on occasion, still show up with something to eat. They're waiting for people who mostly aren't coming back, in front of buildings that mostly aren't standing much longer either, holding a kind of loyalty that was never asked for and will likely never be repaid. Once a year, the town of Chernobyl fills, briefly, with candlelight instead of silence. The Orthodox Church here still holds Easter services, drawing samosely in from surrounding villages by whatever transport they can arrange, a handful of workers on rotation who time their shifts around it, and the occasional visiting priest willing to clear the checkpoint for a single night's ceremony. For a few hours, singing echoes down streets that stay completely silent the other 364 nights of the year, bouncing off building facades that haven't heard a human voice in decades. It looks staged from a distance, like a film set dressed for a scene that isn't really happening in front of you. It isn't staged at all. The congregation is small enough to count by name, but the ritual is entirely real, kept alive by people with every practical reason to have let it lapse decades ago. The dogs have their loyalty and the town has its yearly ritual. But wander past both of them, far enough from the reactor, and the zone drops every trace of ceremony or mascot for something quieter and far less honest. Wildflower meadows, birdsong at dawn, blueberries ripe for picking along a forest trail that could belong to any quiet corner of Eastern Europe. Test that same trail with a handheld dosimeter, though, and the reading can spike without warning within a few meters, then drop back down, just as fast a stride later, tracing an invisible map of contamination that has nothing to do with what's visible above ground, and everything to do with where fallout happened to land on one particular afternoon in 1986. The prettiest patch of forest and the most contaminated patch of forest can sit 20 feet apart, indistinguishable to the eye, the ear, or the nose. Nothing here announces which 20 feet you happen to be standing in, but not every village inside the zone got to fade slowly on its own terms. Some were erased on a schedule, by order, with paperwork attached. In the years after the disaster, Soviet cleanup crews demolished dozens of the most heavily contaminated villages outright, bulldozing houses, barns, and fences into pits dug on the spot and burying the wreckage under fresh soil to seal in the radiation for good. Entire communities that had stood for centuries, that had outlasted famine and 2 world wars, were leveled in a matter of days and marked, if they were marked at all, with a simple metal warning sign. Nobody was supposed to be close enough to read. There was no ceremony, no final photograph, no chance for former residents to walk through one last time and take something to remember it by. There was a schedule, a fleet of bulldozers, and a hole in the ground wide enough to swallow a street hole. Some of those buried villages are barely visible today, even to someone standing directly on top of one. A slight unevenness in an overgrown field, a single chimney stack standing alone with nothing left around it, a fence line that leads to nowhere a fence should logically lead. Pripyat took longer to die, and died in a completely different shape. Home to nearly 50,000 people before the disaster, many of them plant workers and their young families, drawn by good Soviet-era wages and a brand new city built specifically to house them. It was evacuated in a single afternoon on more than 1,000 buses that arrived with barely 2 hours' notice. Residents were told to pack light, that they'd be back within days, and pack their bags accordingly, leaving behind photo albums, wedding china, entire wardrobes for a return trip that never came. Apartments still hold furniture arranged for a homecoming nobody ever made. School books sit open on desks to whatever page a 10-year-old left them on. A department store's shelves have simply gone empty over decades. One slow theft, one collapsed ceiling, one season of scavengers at a time. 4 decades of rain, frost cycles, and stray trees taking root through cracked concrete have done what Soviet demolition crews never had to bother doing here. Reclaim the city structurally, floor by floor, root system by root system, without anyone ever giving the order, and without a single bulldozer ever crossing its checkpoint. And scattered among the buried villages and the slowly collapsing city, a handful of people simply declined to follow either script. They weren't evacuated on time, weren't relocated on schedule, weren't demolished along with everyone else's house, because they walked back in after the trucks left, past the same warning signs meant to keep them out, and stayed through every subsequent attempt to move them along again. Their refusal isn't defiance in the dramatic, cinematic sense of the word. It's closer to inertia with a spine. 40 straight years of quietly not leaving, one growing season and one winter at a time, while entire villages around them went from 600 residents to 3, then to 1, then eventually to none at all. They are still, technically, breaking the law by existing in the exact place where they were born, farmed, married, and buried their own parents. A law nobody in uniform seems especially eager to enforce against someone who has already outlasted 3 governments and 1 nuclear reactor. For years, the danger stayed quiet. Reactor number 4 had run for 2 years past its planned safety review, part of a Soviet grid straining to prove its own reliability. On the night of April 25, 1986, engineers began a routine safety test, one designed to check whether the turbines could keep cooling water flowing during a power failure. It had been delayed, rescheduled, and handed to a night shift less familiar with the procedure than the crew that had originally planned it. The collapse happened in hours, not centuries. A power surge overwhelmed the reactor core just after 1 in the morning on April 26th. 2 explosions tore through the building in seconds, blowing the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor and igniting a graphite fire that would burn openly for 10 days. Workers on shift that night died within weeks. Firefighters who responded, without knowing what they were walking into, absorbed lethal doses before dawn. Then, silence, the frozen aftermath. A Ferris wheel scheduled to open in 5 days. A kindergarten with cots still made for afternoon naps. A control room panel, switches thrown mid-procedure that nobody ever came back to finish resetting. 116,000 people left within days, a number that would eventually swell past 1/3 as the evacuation zone expanded and contracted over the years that followed. And then, against every intention of the people who built the barriers, life found its way back in anyway. Not the human life the planners expected to return, but wolves, storks, and a handful of grandmothers who simply walked home before anyone could stop them, carrying nothing but the keys to houses the state had already written off. A well handle creaking in an otherwise silent yard. A Ferris wheel that never turned. A forest buried under its own dead trees, still glowing faintly on a Geiger counter's screen. None of it adds up to a warning story, exactly, or a hopeful one. It adds up to something stranger. Proof that the line between a wasteland and a home was never really about the ground at all. Radiation didn't decide who stayed. Homesickness did, in defiance of every chart, every checkpoint, every well-meaning order to evacuate and not come back. The reactor changed the land forever. It didn't change what the land meant to the people who buried their families in it. Somewhere in that ring of forest tonight, a lamp is burning in a window that safety inspectors have condemned for 40 straight years. Nobody's coming to turn it off. Somewhere in that ring of forest tonight, a lamp is still burning in a window that's been condemned for 40 straight years. In a house nobody with any sense would call safe. Most of us will never have to choose between safety and home. The people behind that lamp already made that choice, and kept making it, one winter at a time. If a place like this is still worth staying for, subscribe for more stories about the ground the world gave up on, and the people who never did.